My name is Paul Ruiz, and I'm a developer relations engineer with the Android Enterprise team. So today I'm actually going to talk about how you can authenticate your users using a non-Google identity provider. So honestly, though, another name for this talk could have just been, please stop using WebViews. So I know this has come up a lot over the last few years, and we definitely could have just done a little bit better of a job of helping people kind of migrate off, especially since we've been pushing the idea that we should be using Chrome custom, not just like Chrome, but custom tabs in general for authentication. So to add to that, does anyone read the Android Enterprise blog by chance? I'm figuring no one, but cool, exactly no one. Last week we did do an announcement saying that we are going to be deprecating the use of WebViews specifically for authentication. So we are just kind of trying to help people actually migrate over just because custom tabs are going to give us a little bit more room with dealing with the inherent security concerns that are with WebView, as well as kind of paving the way for single sign-on and signal gathering and some other stuff. Let's see here. Actually, if anyone was curious about other authentication talks too, there was one yesterday that was really good on WebAuthn and passwordless authentication. It's going to be stuff that's handled a little bit more on the third-party side or kind of the back end of it. But if you're interested, it's kind of cool. This is going to be more focused on the OAuth 2 side of it and how you'd work on it from the client side. So to help with that transition, I actually have a few things that I'm going to be covering today. So first, I'm just going to briefly talk about the OAuth 2 flow for native apps, so just that everyone is on the same page as we go forward. There is going to be a lot of code at the end of this too, just so you know. That's why I kind of want to get everyone on the same page. Secondly, I'm going to actually go ahead and set up a third-party identity provider for a specific user account. The main reason I wanted to go this route is because Google has this not super helpful habit of always using Google services for every bit of tutorials, documentation, code samples, all that stuff. But in practice, we have only seen 10% of enterprises actually using Google sign-in to do anything. And it just kind of annoys me that Google's use all the Google things when it's not how it works in real life. And then finally, I'm actually going to go over how you can use the AppAuth library to actually implement authentication and authorization with those third-party identity providers. Cool. So there's roughly two camps that we've been hearing from when it comes to authentication. So the first is that authentication is difficult. Some even compare it to working with time zones, which I'm sure some of you know is just incredibly difficult and it's awful. And then the other group we hear from isn't exactly a great picture either. So those that understand how authentication systems work still know it's not always intuitive or seamless. So unfortunately, in the time that we have today, I just don't really have, I'm not going to be able to come up here and answer all of your authentication problems for you. But what I can do is just try to explain some of the non-intuitive aspects, which is kind of using a standard use case. So this way the authentication is going to move from being an obnoxious problem to at least something you can figure out with some of the background knowledge that we pick up today. So there's 4 types of authentication flows outlined in the specification doc for OAuth 2. So these are authentication code, implicit grant, resource owner password credentials, and client credentials. So to keep things simple, I'm just going to actually work with the authentication code grant type, since it's kind of one of the more common for native apps, and then it fits perfectly with the AppAuth library that we're going to cover in a bit. So first, let's go over how authentication works with the whole flow aspect of it. So there's 4 key components to the code grant type flow. So your native app, an authorization and token endpoints, those are actually going to come from your identity provider, and then the web API backend. So starting from your native app, you're actually going to want to open up a custom tab to the authorization endpoint. So this page is going to have a way for the user to provide a username and password to log in with the identity provider. Again, if we kind of go back to that WebAuthn talk that was yesterday, this is going to be where they're going to deal with biometrics or passwordless sign-on and that kind of stuff. So username and password, a little bit kind of older aspect of it, but I mean that's kind of how this will work for this example. Once the user is actually authenticated, though, an authorization code is going to be returned back to your app, and then you can send that authorization code along with a client ID, potentially client secret, and any other necessary information back over to the token endpoint. So if everything matches up correctly with the identity provider and what it's expecting, then it's going to return an access token and a refresh token back over to your native app. You can then put that access token into the authorization header for any API calls that you're going to make to the client, or from the client to your backend. I'm going to kind of go over this a little bit later, but that authorization header is going to be a little bit more of an important part later on. And then once you have that token set, your web API can do a little bit more magic behind the scenes to actually make sure that it's going to match up to a specific user. Then it can decide what information they should have access to. It's going to then wrap up by sending any of that valid data for that user back over to the client application. And then once you get to this point, you're generally going to end up just kind of repeating this process for as long as that access token is still valid. So that said, after a while, you should expect that access token to expire. That way the same token can't just be reused by either the same user or someone unexpected that just kind of somehow ended up with it. So when this happens, assuming that you got your refresh token, then you can just hit the token endpoint again with your refresh token, client ID, and basically anything else that the provider is expecting. And then this is going to end up returning updated access and refresh tokens over to your app. And then with those 2 tokens stored again, you can just kind of go back to making API calls, and it'll kind of do its own magic behind the scene again until it's time to refresh all over. Cool, so now that we have the general idea of how authentication code flow is going to work with OAuth 2, let's actually go ahead and take a minute to set up a third-party identity provider. So for this talk, I'm actually going to use Ping Identity, mainly because they're one of our partners that have been kind of doing best practices on their end. Their documentation was actually super easy for me to get up and running with, which I was really appreciative of. And they're actually based out of my hometown, which extra plus for them. But if you have another identity provider like Okta, OAuth, or Auth0, Microsoft, whoever, just to kind of name a few of them, then this will still be pretty applicable to you. You're just going to have a different UI and all that kind of good stuff. Cool, so first and foremost, we're going to need to set up our identity provider for the authorization code flow. For simplicity, I'm not actually going to use the client secret here, but your use case may require it. There's actually only going to be like 1 line change inside of the code when I do the actual implementation, so if you need it, it'll be pretty simple to use. Also going to want to include a couple of redirect URLs that you're going to use for authenticating your user as well as signing them out. One thing that's worth noting here too is I actually use the schema appauth. You're going to want to do something that's a little bit more unique to your apps, so probably like a package name or whatever. There was a talk back in 2016 for the Android for Work event that kind of goes over the details of why you would want to make this a bit more unique. But yeah. So once everything's configured, we can just check out the URLs that were given to us by the identity provider. And then for this talk, the most important URLs are going to be the authorization and the token endpoints. You'll actually notice these are 2 of the pillars that we had discussed too when we were going over the general OAuth flow. We're also going to want to use the sign-off endpoint whenever it's time to actually log the user off and end their session. And then finally, we're just going to want to add a user profile for the user so that they can log in with their username and password. So generally, this would be handled by your IT admin if you're in an enterprise environment. For this case, I just went through their web API, or not API, UI. I just uploaded a demo account, but that's going to be kind of what I use as I log in. So with all of that out of the way, we can actually start digging into the main content for this talk. So through the rest of this presentation, I'm going to go over how you can use the appauth library for Android to kind of follow all the best practices that have been laid out for authorization using custom tabs. And then it's essentially using this appauth library so you don't have to go through and rewrite everything from the ground up because there's a lot of nuances to it and they kind of have already taken care of that. If you do need to have your own custom implementation though, you can kind of see how appauth did it and kind of steal what you need. Let's see, and then for this case, I'm actually going to just do a single activity app. It's not going to have any of the real architecture behind it, like view models, lifecycle management, unidirectional data flow, or any of the other good stuff that we've kind of grown to love from Android, just to keep it simple and focus on the actual appauth part of it. And then we're also going to use just regular view binding for the UI here instead of Compose, because Compose is still relatively new and it's just kind of not the focal point of this talk. There's 8 other talks this week that are going over Compose. So if you're interested in that, check those out. And then there is going to be a lot of code for the rest of this talk. So if y'all were here a little bit early, I had the bit.ly link up, but also this is being recorded, and then I can post these up on Twitter as well. So if you want to find me later, you can get the links that way to see all the code. So I wouldn't worry about the details so much as the actual ideas behind it. So to get started, this is my base app. Single button, whole bunch of other stuff kind of hidden, nothing too fancy. Again, it didn't need to be just because a lot of this stuff is going to be happening kind of behind the scenes and not in the UI. Some of the other stuff will appear, though, once we actually log in. Moving on to the dependencies, there is a small set that we do need to make sure that we import just kind of for the sample project, just so everyone's on the same page. First one's pretty obvious. If we're using the appauth library, we need to bring that in. I'm also bringing in this JSON web token one from Auth0, JWT. Not too long ago, I learned it's pronounced JOT, and I think that's really stupid. So I'm going to just either call it JSON Web Token or JWT as we move on. Let's see, so in a few slides, I'm actually going to get into why we need it and how it's going to be helpful for us, but for now, it's going to make our lives a little bit easier when we get there. And then I'm just going to bring in a few other extra stuff to make this easy as we move along. So OKHTTP for networking, Picasso for image loading, coroutines for kind of handling like asynchronous operations. Doesn't necessarily mean it's going to apply to you if you got your own preferred libraries that you've either made in-house or you prefer to use like Glide or whatever for image loading. Go ahead and use those. This is just kind of for the example. Use whatever works for you. So after bringing in the dependencies, it's time to actually add this new activity node to the Android manifest file, specifically for this redirect URI receiver class. So this is actually a part of the AppAuth library. It's kind of a little funny. It's kind of a mix between, it's a workaround for custom tabs not being programmatically closable. So once you actually go in and log in and whatnot, it kind of handles taking the window that came up off of the backstack, so it goes back into your app. And it's also there for redirecting any kind of the redirect information back to your app. So when you get back user information, it'll go through this first and then be sent to whatever activity you're using. So one of the big things to notice in this area is that I've actually included a data node that uses a schema and a host, plus this it could have an optional path, just so this activity knows which URIs need to be redirected over to our app. And then I'm also going to add a second intent filter for the example just to handle redirecting logout responses as well. Cool, so additionally, it's kind of important to note that these values should match up to the redirect URIs that were added in the third-party identity provider's console. If they don't match up, it's not going to know how to redirect what, because it's going to be expecting different URLs as it comes along. So just something to pay attention to. You can't just throw together whatever URLs you want. It has to be kind of synced up. And then to wrap up the work in the Android manifest file, we just need to actually go in and add this new intent filter for our auth activity, just to kind of help with routing or routing or however you want to pronounce it here, which in our case is just going to be the main activity. So once we're done with the manifest, it's actually time to jump into our main code. So the first few things here are just some URLs that our identity provider is going to want to use. So in our case, I'm just going to save them as strings in a constant file. You may have your own way of doing this, but it's just kind of easy for this case. In practice, you probably want to have them in a way that you can update these later, just in case they do change on you and you have apps in production. And as we all know, it's really almost impossible to get users to update once they've installed your app. And then you might also recognize some of these URLs just from a few slides ago when we were setting up the identity provider. So where these URLs come from is really going to depend on your identity provider, but it should all be relatively standardized. And then we're also going to need to save our client ID, our redirect URLs, and then for this example, just kind of a API URL that we would call once authentication is complete. I think I just made up one, but yeah. So there's a lot of setup and boilerplate. I'm sorry. We're almost ready to actually get into the core of the app. And that way we can start working with offload. But if you end up coming back and watching this later, you'd be able to kind of figure out how to actually set it up and make sure they're all on the same page. And then while we would want to restore our app's auth state at the startup of the app, if the user were coming back from already authenticating and authorizing and all that good stuff, I'm just going to kind of hand wave that away. So generally you would just save this on a shared preference or some other means. Also going to ignore the init views here, just because it's basically how I'm handling view binding and making sure the UI is kind of updatable. So where things are getting a little bit more interesting is when we get into these two functions. So the first function is where we're going to set up the authorization service configuration object, which for this example is just the object that we're using. I'm just going to store it at the top of main activity. So this is where we're going to bind our authorization URL, token, and logout URLs within with the AppAuth library. And then moving on from there, we're going to initialize our authorization service. So this object is going to be used for making our calls over to our identity provider. And then one extra thing that's actually kind of worth noting here too is that I added a browser matcher here. So it's only going to allow authentication to happen using a Chrome custom tab or a Samsung custom tab, just through this additional AppAuth configuration object. Not really necessary for this example. It's just kind of nice to highlight that you do have other options so you can customize what you need based off of your use cases, and that you have a little bit of flexibility here. Another thing that's worth pointing out here too is the AppAuth configuration object. Shouldn't really be confused with the authorization service configuration object that was on the last slide. I don't know if anyone was in here for the last talk, but naming is difficult.
Maybe after questions?
Yeah. Cool. So with all the setup done, it's actually time to move on to our actual request for an authorization code. So this is typically what you would expect to have like behind a login button within your app. So we're going to start by creating an authorization builder that accepts the auth service config that's contained in our, it's going to contain our auth URL, our client ID, and the response type that we're expecting, which in this case is just going to be code. It's also going to have the redirect URI that's going to be used when our authorization code is returned to us. And then, while it's not necessary for this example, I'm also going to set some scopes just so you can kind of see how they're added in case you need it for your use cases. And then finally, we just need to create the, or we can create this hash map for any additional parameters. Again, not necessary for this demo, but if you do need to have those, then this is how you would do it. And then once we have the request builder actually configured, we can just create a new request object and then use that to create an authorization request intent through our authorization service. And then we can just launch it using an authorization launcher that we're going to define here soon. Though really any way that you want to launch an activity for a result is fine here. So if you're using something like out of app compact or what have you. I'm just using launcher because it's what worked for me. So at this point, your app should actually launch a new custom tab window that's going to direct your users over to the identity provider that you've kind of provided through your URLs. So this is where the identity provider is going to check usernames, passwords, and basically making sure that everything is correct on their end before they kind of return that authorization code to your app. Like I said, with the whole WebAuthn thing too, so like if they're using biometrics or whatever, this is where that's all going to be handled. So you don't really need to worry about this aspect of it, just know that it does happen. Another nice thing about this too is this is where they're going to handle like resetting passwords. So if your user has forgotten it, it'll be handled by them rather than having to put it into your own application. And then once the user is authenticated, the identity provider should return a URL that's going to look like this to your app. So you can see that this URL is going to follow the format that we declared over in our Android manifest file. Again, so here it says appauth. This is where you would just have your package name or whatever to make this a little bit more unique. This is how your user's device is going to know how to forward this URL back over to your app. And the end of the URL is going to have the code that we're going to use for retrieving our token, as well as the state value that we would use for, as y'all can probably guess, actually tracking the user's authorization state. So when this URL gets sent back to our app, it should end up just being handled by the launcher that I'm putting together here that's listening for the activity result. So this is what I just said that we were going to set up a couple slides ago. So assuming the result is okay, then we can just pass in the intent from the response off to another function, which in this case I'm just calling handle authorization response. And then once we get into that handle authorization response function, we can just create a new authorization response object from the pass in intent, check for any errors, and then just save an auth state object based on the state value that's in our response, assuming that this is the first time we've actually gotten a solid reference. Now, if everything's gone correctly up to this point, which hopefully it has, you never know. Things break pretty consistently, unfortunately. But at this point, we can exchange that authorization code that we just received for an auth token. So we can start by creating a token exchange request based off of that initial authorization response. And then from there, we can perform the token request using our authorization service while passing in the token response callback for that function, or to the function rather. One thing that's worth mentioning here too is that if you've set up your provider to expect a client secret, like I mentioned before, I wasn't including that in my identity provider, but if you did need to use it, you can just pass in this client secret basic object into the authorization when you're performing that same token request, and it'll just end up working with it that way. That said, it's really important that you do not save your client secret locally as a hard-coded string. I know I did it for this example. It's terrible practice. Don't do it. It's a secret. You don't want other people getting it. It's actually useful for things. So this is something where you'd want to either retrieve it remotely or do some other stuff just to make sure that it's not stored in your APK and grabbable. So if everything has turned out well, then you should receive a response similar to this one. So the really important pieces of data in this response are, at least for our case, going to be the access token and the ID token, which we're going to use over the next few slides. So when that token response is returned, it's going to get handled by the callback that we just associated with the request. At this point, we're going to check to see if there was an exception in our authorization request, and if there was, we're just going to go ahead and save a new blank auth state object so that our app knows that something didn't succeed and it doesn't try to get messed up in its state understanding. So if everything looks good at this point, we're going to update our auth state using the new response, extract the access and ID tokens, and then use the auth0 library that we imported earlier to create a JSON web token based off that ID token. This is actually something I thought was kind of cool when I was learning about this not too long ago, but this is the actual ID token that gets returned to us. It just looks like this gigantic kind of jumbly string. But once we decode it into the JSON web token, we get a string that's going to look like this. So for our use cases, we're really interested in the email, given name, family name, and the picture, just because that's what I'm using to kind of display within the app for the UI aspect of it. So once we have that information, we can just simply load the strings for the name and the email into their proper views, and then use the profile URL to load the image. So here I'm just using Picasso. It's been around for like 10 years or something already, so I feel like most people know it. But again, if you want to use something else, go for it. It's just loading in an image. And then once that's all said and done, we can see that the profile information for that authenticated user is working in our Android app. So this is that same UI that we had earlier, just kind of added everything and made it visible. And then since we're going to have our authorization token ready to go at this point, we can just start thinking about making our API calls over to our backend. So one thing that's actually great about the app auth library too is that you can perform this perform action with fresh tokens call with the library, and it's actually going to automatically handle refreshing your tokens if it's necessary when you're making your API calls, as long as you're passing in the proper parameters for it. And then once the token is confirmed good or is refreshed without any exceptions actually happening, you can perform your API calls from a non-UI thread. Again, this is a networking call, so it doesn't need to be on a back end. I wasn't going to go into too terribly much. Just make sure you do it in the back end, or otherwise it's going to not be a good time. Background thread. As far as how you perform that API call, it's going to be up to you, but the important thing for this example is that you add the authorization header and the bearer token into your request. This is kind of what I was talking about earlier with adding in that authorization header. This is how you would do it. Same idea as if you were using Firebase or whatever, where you're passing your own tokens. And then finally, once the user is done with our app and ready to log out, we can just create a new end session request with the user's ID token, as well as the redirect URL that will be used specifically for handling the case of them logging out. So with that all put together, we can just launch an end session request intent that's created through the authorization service, and that redirect URL is going to get caught just like our initial authorization redirect that was, and then it's going to be handled accordingly based off of that redirect. And then when it's time to close the app, the final step is just going to be unregistering the launchers that we had used earlier. Again, if you're using something like AppCompat for retrieving those results, you don't really have to worry about it. I'm just including these because that's how I did it. But essentially, that is a basic way that you would use the app auth library for authenticating against a third-party identity provider. If you are interested in this in actual solid detail and a good lesson, I am working on a code lab, moving app auth over to working with Kotlin and all that, because I promised my manager I would, which means it should get done hopefully. And it'll use more of your modern Android-y features and all that kind of good stuff. There's my email if anyone has questions that you want to message me later if you run into issues. Twitter handle if you want to get the slides, I'll post them later. Other than that, it is just before lunch, so I'm not going to hold people hostage, but if you have questions, come up here and I will answer them. Cool, thank you.